frankly, a lot of the work that that folks with a lot of very fancy degrees are doing is extraordinarily unvaluable, even if very well paid. And conversely, and this is something I think we saw in spades during the pandemic, a lot of the work that garners the least respect in our society is actually a lot of the most important.
I read and enjoyed your book that came out in 2018, The Once and Future Worker, and I thought it was a really, really, really helpful resource, very well researched. I recommend it to our listeners. I think many Americans are concerned by what we are seeing in the labor force, and I worry about the effects of drugs and alcohol debilitating people in large numbers. I worry about marijuana policy becoming overly liberalized. I worry about overly generous government benefits, essentially paying people not to work. I worry about immigration driving down wages in numerous industries. And just recently, the Wall Street Journal editorial board wrote, quote, the civilian labor force on the household survey shrank by 186,000 last month, while the participation rate ticked down 0.1 percentage point to 62.1%. As a result, the unemployment rate stayed flat at 3.7%. Labor force participation remains significantly down from 63.4% before the pandemic. Oren, as the authority on the once and future worker, what are a few of the top concerns that you have about labor market trends in our country and what should be done about them?
Well, I think that was a great summary of a lot of the concerns. The basic problem is that we see a real decline in workforce participation nationwide. And I think it's really important to focus on key segments of the population. I mean, if there are more, mothers or fathers choosing to stay home and raise young children, that might reduce the labor force participation. That's not necessarily a bad thing if that's what families want to do. If you have more people who are of retirement age who aren't working, that's obviously not a problem. But if you zoom in on what we'd call kind of prime age workers, so say age 25 to 55, you look primarily at men who are typically the ones who both parents would say they expect to have working, even if they have young kids at home, you still see a significant drop. And so the decline in prime age workforce participation, especially among men, especially among younger men, I think is what the heart of the problem is. And that's something that predates the pandemic. It's really been going on for a few decades now. But the pandemic has definitely been an accelerant of that trend. And I think it's just really important to recognize that, when we look at something abstract like a labor force participation rate of 61.3%, and, what does it mean to have it up or down a tenth of a percentage point? It can seem like maybe much ado about nothing, but the reality is if you look at the trend over the last few decades, we have literally millions of men who just aren't working. Or might want full-time work but be working part-time, and are certainly having a lot of trouble finding jobs that would allow them to support a family. And we can talk a lot more about what are the causes of this, but recognizing that it's happening, and that it itself is a cause, I think, of a lot of the problems we have in this country, can be really clarifying in helping to focus on what's gone wrong and what we need to do.
That's right. So what do you see as the most significant factors keeping people who probably should be in the labor force out of the labor force? And I remember in your book, you discussed a little bit the effects of disability benefits, a really almost suspiciously high number of young men who could potentially be able-bodied, maybe being encouraged to take disability if certain types of jobs are going away or other types of things. So what do you see as some of the driving factors keeping especially prime age men out of the labor force?
Well, I think it's helpful at the broadest level to divide it into two categories, that we have some really fundamental economic problems and then also some very serious cultural problems. And I think one of the worst habits on the right of center is to think that we have to choose between these things and say, oh, this isn't an economic problem, it's all about culture. And the answer is, of course, it's both. There are very serious problems we've had in our culture, something that, frankly, in a lot of cases, conservatives have not been especially helpful on, in terms of just recognizing the value of work, setting the expectation that people should be working, making clear that we see tremendous value. Obviously, there's economic value in work, but also there's social value in it, that people should be um, they should be productive contributors to their communities. They should be supporting their families. And then on the flip side, if they're doing those things, they should be receiving significant respect and admiration for doing that. And I think even on the right of center, we've had a real habit of doing the opposite, of talking about things like dead end jobs, of saying, we need to get everybody into and through college, as if certain types of work are more valuable than others, even when, frankly, a lot of the work that folks with a lot of very fancy degrees are doing is extraordinarily unvaluable, even if very well paid. And conversely, and this is something I think we saw in spades during the pandemic, a lot of the work that garners the least respect in our society is actually a lot of the most important. And so I think in cultural terms, really returning to a valorization of work and a recognition that the person who goes to work every day and does a job that's not especially glamorous, might not be especially well paid, but is vital to our society, is vital to his family. That's the most important work. That's what's deserving of the most respect.